Yeah, I can tell my story about how I get into becoming an entrepreneurial journalist, and then
Yeah.
I'll come straight out of the back of that and talk about the way I see the marketplace emerging.
Great. Excellent. When we were covering the Iraq War, the invasion, 2000 war, 2000, yeah, 2003 war, were you then with RTE, or were you doing it for some?
No, that was for that was for RT exactly. So I was the foreign affairs correspondent,
Mhm.
and I worked for them during that period. So yeah, that was until 2009 when I left.
Yeah.
That story.
Yeah, Glenn must have been your colleague. Glenn is a friend of mine.
Glenn Killan.
Glenn Malcoy.
Yes, Glenn. Sorry, yes, of course. He definitely in our mojo pioneer. Great guy, yeah. So have you been to Dublin or are
Yes,
you?
I've been there. Yeah, yeah,
Great.
yeah. I lived
Well,
in England for 7 years. I lived in England. Actually, I went to school there in Newcastle, Northeast. Geordies, we call it Geordies.
yeah. Uh, one of the few English accents that I find it hard to understand is Geordie. Yeah.
Geordies is one of them. Yeah. Glenn still has that Irish accent, very heavy Irish accent.
Yes, he does. Yeah, no, he that event he organized in Galway in the west of Ireland, which was great. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Okay, people, can we get started? Yeah. So I don't think you need an introduction because I've already shared your story with them. So it's over to you, Mark.
Great. Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor to be joining you. I know in your evening, around my midday. I won't assume that everyone knows all about my career, but I suppose what I'd like to do maybe for a few minutes is obviously tell my story about somebody who was very firmly full-time journalist. I mean, when I was a child, from the age of maybe 4 or 5 years old, I wanted to be either an international soccer player or a journalist. So I had very little natural talent, so I became a journalist. But I really did from the very earliest age. Just I hero worshipped the journalists that I saw on the television, particularly those that were foreign correspondents that were reporting from the war zones of the world or places where there was incredibly frantic pace of change. And obviously in Ireland, where I grew up, we were very much in the shadow of the BBC. So journalists like John Simpson would have been heroes of mine when I was growing up, but also I would have been very influenced as well by American journalism. So going right back to the era of people like Ed Murrow, who was one of the, I suppose, parent figures of TV journalism and how it should be done. So I was steeped by the age of 12 or 11 or 12 years old in this history of journalism that I really wanted to be part of. So, I got to live my dream. And what I'll do is maybe I'll share with you, and hopefully this is if you can see this right here, this is maybe a little presentation that might give you a bit of an understanding of my journey to become an entrepreneur. So, I mean, vaguely just tell you how I got from war zones to the boardrooms that I inhabit right now. If you can see this is my very first publicity photograph when I did become a full-time journalist. This was 1991, I think. So almost 30 years ago. This is the first publicity shot that was taken of me as a journalist. What I find most remarkable about this photograph is this was a very different era in terms of technology. The technology of journalism was very rudimentary back then. So if you look at their terminal, the computer terminal I was using there, that wasn't connected to the internet. Clearly, there was no such thing as mobile journalism. We were still stuck on rotary phones. And in the background there, when I began, I was a radio journalist. These were tapes we used to use, and we would cut them up with razor blades. These were magnetic tapes that we would splice together for broadcast, not for radio shows. There was no such thing as podcasts. So in the space of my career, I think I was probably at the tail end of what was a very low-tech form of journalism, even though at that time we were starting to see the emergence of satellite news gathering, as it was called then, where you could go to a foreign location and transmit back by satellite. But still, the change was very gradual over the period of my career. So I was obviously somebody who was interested in telling stories from abroad, from the world. One of the places that I suppose I fell in love with was Iran. As I became a foreign correspondent, like every foreign correspondent, there's one place in the world that just gets under your skin that you can't stop thinking about. So for me, that was Iran. This is me in the city of Esfahan, right back around 2007. I'm always showing this photograph to show you how still it wasn't very glamorous, as we call making the sausage. There was a lot of people that were needed to make me look good as a TV correspondent. And in many ways, when I was going to a place like Esfahan, um, my connection with the place I was describing wasn't that authentic. It was very much, especially for English language speaking journalists, going to a place like Iran or Iraq or Afghanistan. We were in many ways repeating second or third hand the stories of the places that we were reporting on. So particularly for English speaking journalists, foreign correspondency was not very real or raw. And that was something that started to irritate and I think frustrate me around that time, 2007. And this was remembered at the time that Twitter was born and Facebook a couple of years earlier. And for me, there was a light bulb moment when I realized I had to change career, or at least change the way I thought about journalism. It was 2009 when there was protests against a contested election in Iran. It wasn't the foreign correspondents like myself or John Simpson who were reporting this story, this momentous story. It was young people on the streets of Tehran with mobile phones that were connected to social networks like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And so when I remember seeing this, and I couldn't go to Iran for that story, my TV news channel, RTE, which is the Irish equivalent of BBC, couldn't send me. So I sat there at home in Dublin watching this world event unfolding on Twitter. And I was suddenly overcome with this feeling that something was beginning and something was ending. And in some ways, the old days of the foreign correspondent were coming to an end. And what was replacing, or at least being born for me, was a new form of, it wasn't even journalism, it was storytelling that was very much more authentic and real. And in some cases, visceral. It was something that hit you in the stomach when you saw a real photograph from a place like Iran or Tehran that wasn't taken by a journalist. That was actually the testimony of an ordinary person who suddenly could talk to the world. And so I thought about that long and hard, and I decided, well, why can't we form a partnership between traditional journalism and what was then called citizen journalism, people on the streets? And we did that with a company that I founded called Storyful. So I left my good job as a TV anchor and foreign correspondent to set up a startup. I was very naive, but I was also very lucky, because when I set Storyful up back in 2010, the Arab Spring was beginning. And if you remember, this was when, in the early days at least, this exciting democratic promise of dissent against those old Arab regimes was starting to come across on social platforms. I very much remember this image, which I love. It was of a protester near Tahrir Square in Cairo, just showing the exhilarating sense of dissent that was coming through in a very authentic way from places like Cairo and Algeria and then Syria. And so in the early days, we started to see a lot of democratic promise coming from social media. We saw, for example, back in Tehran, this was a group called Stealthy Freedom, which was women activists protesting against the compulsory hijab. And again, for me, I was just so intoxicated by the potential of social media to be a democratic force. But about the same time, and this is kind of what Storyful did, was we were starting to see the enemies of democracy, or at least groups that were trying to hijack social media, becoming very active on platforms like Twitter. So on the left-hand side here, you see tweets coming from the Israeli Defense Forces warning reporters to stay away from, at that point, a flashpoint. And then right afterwards, we see the armed wing of Hezbollah coming back and essentially threatening the Israelis. On the right-hand side, this is something you will probably remember, which was the first time we started to see ISIS committing really violent actions in the name of their cause, and then using social media to distribute what were very high quality videos, horrible videos, but they were also very high quality. So they traveled with a real power on social media. So we started to realize in Storyful that our job was not just to promote the good content that we could see, but try detect, and if we could, halt the spread of disinformation, of misinformation. And so, for example, we remember this is back in, I think, 2013, when we don't know who, but someone hijacked the Associated Press account on Twitter, reporting falsely that Barack Obama had been injured in the White House. And below the tweet, you can see the stock market in the United States at that very moment dropping in response to that false tweet. So we saw our job as to correct this disinformation in real time. On the right-hand side, you see, for example, another piece of work Storyful did, where we would see an event like a plane crash, which was just an accident, but many people on the internet, for all kinds of political purposes, were trying to imply there was some sort of criminal act behind this particular accident. And so, for example, we would see disputes over events like the downing of a Malaysian airliner. This is way back in 2013, when Storyful was there to try and establish the truth of what we could see by using what we now call open source intelligence gathering. That is, going on to platforms like YouTube and checking the details that we could see in a very forensic way, in this particular case, to prove that it wasn't an accident, that this particular airliner was downed. I might just play you a video here. Hopefully you can hear the soundtrack on this. This is a little bit more detail about how we did our work at Storyful.
We are part of a golden age of journalism and storytelling. Everybody now is a storyteller. There's hundreds of hours of YouTube video uploaded every single minute. When everybody's telling a story, which stories are worth listening to?
Storyful's first social media news agency in the world.
One of the big stories we've been covering today is Yemen. We found this pretty dramatic video. So what we want to do is go to Google Maps, establish the location. We find the building here, which matches exactly. And now we're going to attempt to get clearance for the content and provide it to our clients for use. Hi, my name is Joe Galvin. I'm a journalist with the news agency Storyful.com.
We've really prided ourselves in trying to build technology matched with expert journalism to basically mine the social web.
Anything that's happening in social media anywhere in the world, on any platform, we find it, we curate it, we post it.
Technology has really made our job different in that we can get the stories that are meaningful and truthful out there.
Google tools and services have been critical for us since the very beginning, from translation to 24-hour Google Hangout. When human skill matches really cool technology, it's greater than the sum of the parts. And that's the reason why Storyful has had such traction.
It's about storytelling, being able to match that with technology to find the stories worth telling. How do we take the pulse of the internet to get to the truth and really contextualize it, editorialize it?
Defining the narrative, that's the search for truth. And that's what Storyful is doing, bringing an authenticity to storytelling.
I get up every day because I believe journalism plays an incredibly important role in the power of user-generated content.
It makes me feel empowered that social media today is such a vital role in people being able to share their stories.
Helping people tell their stories and their truth. We take it very seriously. It's a source of great pride.
Social media is going to be media. Social journalism will be journalism. And I'm looking forward to the time when Storyful will become absolutely standard within journalism.
So as you can tell, we were pioneers in many ways, that team at Storyful. This is the team here. In fact, I'm looking at some of those faces now, some of those people working for CNN, some working for the BBC. Storyful still exists, as you can probably tell, and we successfully found a business model, as well as just doing what we thought was, at the time, very important work enabled by technology. We were also working out a business model as we went. As you probably can guess, a lot of the work we were doing on human rights, a lot of the work we were doing on hard news, whether it was emerging from Yemen, was not necessarily generating the revenue. we also found that we could generate revenue by finding viral videos, the videos that you will probably see on television, that you will see on websites across the world, that are the kind of and finally videos, the funny cat videos, kids doing amazing things. And so we worked out the strategy where the serious journalism was up front, was the thing that we talked about most, that we were proudest of, that had most impact. But what was making money predominantly was licensing agreements that we could reach with the uploaders of videos on places like YouTube, where we together with that uploader could make an awful lot more money. So we would take a video, for example, where a parent might film their child doing something funny or amazing. We'd find that video similar to the way we'd find videos from war zones. And then we'd agree a commercial licensing that would benefit the uploader, but would also give us a share of the revenue that we could generate. We'd take that video, we'd go to a platform like AOL, which obviously was more important then than it is now. We would market that on YouTube. We did a deal with YouTube where they would promote our videos. So we were essentially generating lots of money from those videos, which we were giving back in majority of at least to the uploader of the video, but sharing the revenue with our partners as well. So that's what got us drawn to News Corporation, which was bought Storyful back at the end of 2013, primarily because of the video business. But thankfully, they protected the news business as well. And today Storyful has, I think, about 200 people all over the world doing the work that you've just seen, but also then generating a lot more value with a lot more partners, including major video channels and news channels. So that was the work of Storyful. When I look back, I have to say I was probably a little naive. I believed in the democratic power of social media. I wasn't right prepared for maybe the ways things went wrong. After Storyful, I had a sort of a third act. So my first act was my journalism career. My second act was Storyful. The third act was really getting more involved in the technology of social media. I joined Twitter as the head of partnerships for the European and Middle East and Africa. This was the team that I ran. I was also the managing director of Twitter's international headquarters, which happens to be in Dublin. And this was my team. I spent a really some fantastic time at Twitter. Unfortunately, Twitter was going through difficult times at that stage. This was back in 2016. And the team that I ran was essentially let go. And I decided that I wanted to move on to another challenge. And that's where I started to understand the scale, the second really big problem that needed to be solved. So there's a great political poster in the United States called Nate Silver, wrote a great book that I highly recommend, which is essentially talking about the inability of people to be able to cope with the massive increase in information that is coming at us every day. So when we started Storyful, there was maybe 15 hours of video uploaded on YouTube every single minute. Today, it's 500 hours. So this for me is probably the greatest challenge facing journalism in this new second wave of the internet, is how do we help people cope with this overwhelming abundance of information? But also, how do we find a way to reform the bad things about social media, particularly its business model, which emphasizes emotion over quality? So the way the business model works on a platform like Facebook is it's trying to generate in us emotions, particularly outrage and fear and happiness obviously as well, but it's much more important that content on Facebook is promoted to make you feel an emotion rather than promoted to be quality, to promote trust. So this is the problem that I've been thinking about a lot in my third act as a journalist, as an entrepreneur. So I got back together again with one of my colleagues from Storyful, Anya Kerr. She had gone to Facebook when I was in Twitter, and we had seen inside the social platforms, and we wanted to build a new experience of information for citizens that would empower them and give them control over the algorithms that were promoting content on platforms like Twitter and Facebook. So we set up a company called Kinsen. This is a company that was set up 3 years ago. And what we're essentially doing is we're building a new type of algorithm and recommendation system that is helping traditional journalism scale itself so that it can meet the challenges of disinformation and misinformation. So we've identified as our business model helping content platforms and any online community protect itself from false information in particular, but also other toxic content like hate speech. So we built tools for an editorial network, our own editors, but also some other partners, which allow them to evaluate content that is false but also harmful right across platforms, from the big content platforms to some of the fringe networks. And in the course of their work, they are creating data that's helping us then build machine learning models that are scaling their work. So it's a feedback loop. Editors are involved at every stage in building these algorithms that are promoting quality content and detecting the harmful content. And so, for example, we build software that's allowing editors to go and look at podcasts and videos online, which has been a traditional blind spot. And we're also then building machine learning models that are detecting content that we know is associated with problematic narratives of disinformation, for example, surrounding the impact of COVID or the impact of vaccines. So that's where we are now, where our business model is essentially a bit like what we might call in the startup world, enterprise software that is large contracts based on technology, but also professional services on top with the major content platforms, two of the major content platforms, but also we've just raised some funding that's going to allow us to expand to other customers over the coming year. So what I'd like to finish off with my story, where I think I can be helpful maybe in our conversation to follow, is you've seen my journey from traditional journalism in the days when this was the reality. This is back from the 1960s, when journalists essentially talked to the audience. We told them when to sit down and watch the TV news, or we said to them, pick up your newspaper in the morning. And the audience couldn't answer back. There was no direct connection between the journalist and the community that they served. So that was journalism then. For me, we're at a new point now where journalism today is about a journalist having a direct connection to the community that they serve. That community may be based on location, it might be based on profession, or the passion of a particular community. And for me, that is the real bonanza, the real opportunity for entrepreneurial journalism, is to understand that technology has given us the power to build connections with communities as individual journalists, where before we would have had to join a big news organization to command that audience, to command that connection. And I believe there are new business models that we can create based on deep connection to communities that will solve many of the problems that have hit traditional news organizations who are depending on advertising. And of course, social platforms came along and took all that advertising. We can also fix some of the problems that we're now seeing on social media, the promotion of disinformation, by allowing citizens to have confidence that when they join certain communities that are being hosted by entrepreneurial journalists, they can trust the information inside that community. So for me, having spent the last 10 years in two businesses that I started, in social platforms that were clearly based on the old business model, having worked for News Corporation, a traditional media organization that was struggling to maintain its relevance, the biggest lesson that I have, I suppose, learned in those 10 years is that we're not at the end of a period. We're at the beginning of a new form of engaged journalism, where the new business model, and it's not just about paywalls or subscriptions, there's a lot more, I think, revenue that can be generated, where an individual journalist is serving the needs of a community through a whole range of experiences, from newsletters and podcasts, and perhaps even video channels on YouTube. And they can find ways to generate revenue on the basis of their engagement with these individuals. Now, it will take technology to help us realize those opportunities, but I think what it takes most importantly is a new mindset for journalists, that they shouldn't necessarily be seeking the big job with the TV station or the newspaper, and certainly not the big job with the social platform. Instead, It's finding ways to find your community and then understanding what's engaging them. What do they care for? It's building their trust. And it's out of that trust that I think a whole range of business models are potentially possible. A whole range of new types of journalism are possible. And in so many ways, there's a great quote from Jeff Bezos when he was founding Amazon back in 1997. And he said, everybody around me is thinking, the internet is the end of other models. For me, it's day one. And I'd like everybody to be thinking about what they want to do now that we have this day one of a new form of journalism that's based on an engagement with community. And I think that's the great, for me, hopeful thing when I hear so many people of my age and my generation bemoaning the end of journalism. I kind of think that's ridiculous. I think we've seen the end of one particular chapter of journalism, and we're now seeing the beginning of a new chapter. And I think as entrepreneurial journalists, you can be at the forefront of what I think could be a great democratic experiment, but more importantly, a way sustaining old values of journalism with new business models that are starting to emerge. So I'm going to stop there because I've probably talked longer than I expected, and I don't want to waste your time, but I thought I might just give you that journey so we can set some context on perhaps where I can be helpful. But that's my presentation, and really happy to open it up to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mark. Guys, it's all yours.
Good morning, sir. I wanted to ask you about the technology, the business models that you talk about in media industry. And previously, you talked about how innovators are failing their consumers. Is something that I want to talk about. And when we have Musk working on Neuralink, we have Oculus doing wonderful work in VR and AR, and in that kind of a scenario, it's how do you think that innovators are actually failing consumers and not the reverse, actually? Because in the gaming industry we see constant demands for better kits and better modules lead to a very abusive power in the video game industry. So is it innovators who are failing consumers, or is it the reverse?
I think part of the problem is, it's an old phrase, with if all you have is a hammer, every problem becomes a nail, right? And so I think the dominant business models that were based on advertising and generating, billions of eyeballs so that somebody could be registered as a viewer for the purposes of selling an ad. And so out of that, we built programmatic advertising. And programmatic advertising is essentially an automated system where audiences are generated, advertising is placed against the eyeball without any human involvement. And it's very similar to the model, I think, that led to the financial collapse of 2008, where financial institutions built these algorithms that generated, incredibly complex financial instruments that nobody could understand, and they eventually led to the collapse of the financial system. We are in a very similar situation today, where every innovator in this sort of business model that we currently have is frustrated because the money's not coming from serving a community well. The money is coming from gaining a system of programmatic advertising. So I think your examples are really, really powerful, where if we think about Twitch potentially is the first, well, not the first, but one of the leading platforms that can turn around and say, you know what, we don't need programmatic advertising, because we're selling right now. I mean, one of my favorite examples of entrepreneurial content creation is how musicians and performers have decided, now that they can't perform in public, to go to Twitch. And we've seen some of the biggest performances in the past 6 months have been on Twitch. They've been on other online content creation and gaming platforms. And so we're starting to see people saying, well, actually, now that we've had COVID and we've been forced to change our way of thinking about our connection to an audience, this programmatic advertising model, it's inhibiting us. Can we find new ways? And of course, gaming is the ultimate community engagement tool, right? So, you buy an extra shield on your favorite game, or you buy a chat function with your friends so you can play it together. So these new models, and I think you've really hit this new nail on the head. which is allowing your audience to be empowered. You're not thinking about grabbing their attention so much as giving them a way to do something. In the case of a gaming platform, it may be to buy new lives or new, whatever, avatars or outfits, or it may be to chat to people like themselves playing the same game, or it may be to see their favorite musician on their favorite gaming platform. So all of this for me is the way forward. Now, think about for journalism what that might mean. Let's say you have some augmented reality, and you're describing a neighborhood to, let's say, you've got 1,000 subscribers to this local community platform, and it may have started as a newsletter, or you may host a podcast, and you decide to walk around your neighborhood with augmented reality and describe an everyday reality. This is what it's like to do a piece of reporting that has literally got a sort of a three-dimensional quality to it. And maybe that's your premium product. Or perhaps you host a conversation every week that's only accessible to members. But see the difference here. You're not trying to grab people's attention and then go to a machine and sell an advert against them. You're selling some premium value to members of the community that have decided that you are someone they trust. And once we have that kind of scenario, and again, it's not just about subscription or paywalls, because I think there's a danger that we're all going to move behind these paywalls and going to leave behind the vast majority of the citizens we need to serve. But let's call it membership. So someone donates to you. Now, the innovation that you are essentially going to be forced to consider, whether it's AR or it's audio and you're a text journalist, or it's video and you're a podcaster, or it's weekly conversations, on a platform like Twitch. So I think that's why I'm so excited, is that before this, so much innovation was stifled because the dominant business model was so exploitative, and really nobody cared about innovation because, the machines were working in the background and we're all very happy. And it reminds me a lot of those kind of real estate agents in places like Florida. If you ever see the movie The Big Short, everybody's just flipping houses. And, that's what was happening, I think, over the past few years. And that's why in some ways the pandemic has been such a spur to innovation. I have a friend, for example, in New York, who's a wine shop. And once the pandemic came, he had to close the wine shop. He thought that was it, he's out of business. Then he thought, well, people still need wine. So he set up online. He now sells online. Then he decided, well, people want to sort of talk about their wine. So he'll hold a weekly conversation. Then he put up a Shopify widget. So now he's having the conversation, but selling wine at the same time. And now he's hosting content and he's curating content about wine. So now he's kind of a content platform that just also happens to sell wine. And I think in 6 months, when you think about that kind of real change, that's where I get my grounded passion for this next generation. And I think, we can talk about many examples of that for journalism, but I think the dominant ones right now would be content creators on Patreon. Obviously, Substack is probably at the moment, everybody in journalism is very excited by newsletters becoming a way for a community to emerge. But I also think Stripe, if you think about the payment systems now, that will mirror a lot the Chinese mobile commerce model, where donations and tips will become more important. So right now, I think as a journalist, I'd be setting up a dashboard that would have a newsletter, a podcast, community conversation. I'd have a donation bucket there as well. I might even be thinking about how I can do live events, and then maybe thinking about cooperating with other journalists like me to form networks that aren't traditional newsrooms, but are kind of almost cooperatives. So let's just say you're covering politics in your town, and you decide to find other bloggers, journalists who are covering politics in their town, and maybe set up a joint conversation or maybe a common paywall for premium content behind, and then market it together. So I think that's an example of an experiment that I've seen happening in the United States, which is obviously where a lot of the technology press is focused always on the US. I think there are other examples like Splice out of Singapore, which is serving obviously Asian entrepreneurial journalism. Very good friend of mine, Alan Soon, used to be a Yahoo executive. If you go onto splicemedia.com, you'll see great examples of that kind of innovation focused mainly on Asian journalism. So they're just some of the examples I think that are possible once you leave behind the old business models. Now, one last thing, your point about consumer behavior, you're right, it is lagging behind in journalism because the famous old Henry Ford line about, you ask people what they want faster horses, not cars. So we are in a bit of I think, a lull where consumers are not demanding of journalism what they're demanding of their favorite gamer or their favorite movie creator or their favorite musician. And it's going to take a little bit of time before people understand that they should expect much better user experiences from journalism than we've been serving them under the old model. And certainly traditional publishers have been very slow. I always think traditional publishers are trying to solve the last business model failure instead of trying to think about the opportunities for this new decentralized model of journalism that is now a reality.
So I had one more question, the last question. That is, you have you have experienced one transition, that was the Y2K transition and the inflation that happened 2008, and you have been in contact with one of the men in media, Rupert Murdoch, and so if he was the big shot of 90s. So now we are experiencing another transition post COVID and the entire media scenario, which will change after the pandemic. So how do you see the transition happening, and what do you see is the future of media after COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a convergence happening, as well as the rise of independent journalism that I've just talked about, and I'll come back to that. But for the big dominant platforms and for the big dominant publishers like Rupert Murdoch, there's a convergence happening. The big platforms now understand that they have to act more like publishers. So these technology companies are now making more decisions about content moderation. So for example, Twitter applying labels to Donald Trump's tweets during the US election. Meanwhile, a big publisher like Rupert Murdoch knows he's got to act more like a technology company. He's got to embrace artificial intelligence, new forms of personalization of content, new approaches to new medium formats like podcasting. And in fairness to Murdoch, even though, politically, he's obviously the most controversial publisher in the world, and we were very conscious working with him. But the one thing about him was when you walked into a room with him, he wanted to know the new thing. What's the new thing that's going to happen? And so that's why in many ways News Corporation is doing quite well with some of its businesses. The problem is these big publishers are all about one thing, the survival of their institutional power. And that, I think, is when publishers start to get into really difficult waters, because if Rupert Murdoch's purpose is to hold power over the Prime Minister of Australia or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom or the White House, then that's not consistent with innovation. That really isn't. However, when you see something like the New York Times, which has 700 people work for the New York Times product team, 700. I mean, that's massive numbers. You start to see New York Times and they are a technology company and they don't really think about the power. They're thinking about ways in which they can kind of decentralize their connections with communities. So among their most lucrative revenue sources are things like crosswords, recipes, premium communities. So I think you'll see when publishers do that kind of innovation, they will be successful. But the ones that try hold on to their power, that's going to be totally eaten away. So there has to be some ways for people like Rupert Murdoch to, probably give up a little bit of the power and almost think about themselves more like platforms. So if I was, and I know some European publishers doing this at the moment, if I was a big publisher, I would be finding ways to seed new cooperative journalism at a local level, help platforms like Nextdoor, which is the next location-based platform to come out of the US. I want to be able to have local communities that I support by giving them marketing services, personalization engines, possibly, other payment systems. So if I was a big publisher right now, I would be finding ways to give my technology, my platform to people like you, giving you ways of, pulling together the best, what we call a customer relations CRM tool, right? So you know exactly what your subscribers or members are doing at every point, and you understand their behaviors. And so I think that's the future for big publishing, is to think like a technology company and be going out and looking for partnerships with the hundreds of thousands of influencers, curators, creators, and individual journalists that are now building their own communities thanks to decentralized tools like Stripe or Patreon or Substack. I think that's the future for big news organizations like the New York Times, or any major regional organization in the world today. But the ones that don't do that and think that they can just be close to the government in their country, or try and be ideological and just side with one side over another, or create polarization, they are powerful now, but they won't maintain that power unless they can find ways to decentralize and give power back to the communities they're supposed to serve. So I'm not saying we won't see the end of partisan journalism. That will always be appealing to a group of people. But I do feel like we're entering a period now where if I was Rupert Murdoch, I wouldn't be thinking about Boris Johnson or Joe Biden. I mean, I'd be thinking about you guys. How do I make sure that I give you the ability to set up your own individual businesses? But again, that's after 10 years of experience. I might not have said that 10 years ago.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this.
So I have a question. Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So my question is, when you start something on your own, especially in a field like journalism, where trust is a major factor, to convince the audience that they have to trust your new product will take a time, right? And now there's two ways about it. One, you could break a big story and then you could gain credibility, or you can go to inorganic growth, promote your content. But if you promote your content too aggressively, then people might become too suspicious. So it's a very tricky situation here. So as an entrepreneur, somebody starting something, you need credibility to survive in this industry. How do you attain that?
Yeah, by doing something that journalists traditionally have not been good at, and that's being curious and listening. So journalists are paid to give their opinions to a community of people. What I've found is this phrase, engaged journalism, has become, I think, a really interesting phrase to use, because there's projects like the Membership Puzzle in the United States, led by Jay Rosen, which has also supported The Correspondent, which is a Dutch startup, which is also part of a network that includes a company that I happen to be friendly with called Harken. And Harken is a good example of the model that I would recommend for this. It's a great question. The answer I would say is, if you were setting up, let's say, a newsletter for, let's go back to the original example, gaming in your town, what would you do first? You would go out, obviously, to try to promote yourself and say, hey, I've got a newsletter. I'm just going to talk about things that gamers like. Now, you set it up, obviously. The first thing you might do is promote yourself on a social platform that you feel gamers are active on, or maybe just getting your friends or some of your family. And you begin by asking, what should I cover? What do you care about? And that question, if you think about it, is a revolutionary act. When I was a TV correspondent, nobody ever cared what the audience wanted. We didn't even care about ratings, because we were journalists. We're not going to be led by ratings. Today, I feel, if you started up a new business that was appealing to a community, asking them to suggest ways of covering it or topics they want covered, and this is where Harken is a good example, HEARKEN. They will go to a journalism organization and newsroom and allow them to allow the audience to ask them questions about, hey, why is it that people don't spend enough on education in my neighborhood? And the newsroom then goes, oh, that's interesting. Didn't realize that was a story. And they go actively report the story with the suggestion and the involvement of the public and the audience. So to give you back to the gaming example, and someone says, I want to know about, I'm going to show my ignorance here because I'm not of that age group, but like whatever the next game will be. I want to talk to the person that created that. And so you will say, thanks for the suggestion. and do a story, right there, you have created like an investment of trust, because all the studies show us that the key of online trust is what they call benevolence. That is, the person that I trust has my interest at heart. So, you know, when you're friends and one of your friends knows a lot about films and another person knows a lot about music and someone else about technology, you know, you start to understand that someone in your company you trust to give you a recommendation of the best phone to buy, but you wouldn't ask that person for a recommendation for a restaurant. So that's what happens in online communities. Someone comes in and goes, hey, I want to give you something that meets your needs and your interests. How can I do that for you? And it's just asking that question, I think, is the first act of engaged journalism. And from there, you can make mistakes and say, you know, sorry about that, I screwed up. And that person may tell you how you might do better. So it's that idea of taking the journalist and just making them a part of the community, but just a more informed member of that community. That's the tone, I think, that starts from the beginning. And then people will accept you sending them a daily reminder or a request every month for a tip or a membership, because you've earned the trust first before you make a hard pitch to them. And I think that's the way I would think about it. So a good way of doing it is like product development and design thinking are two skills that journalists don't get taught normally, but of course you guys will know that embracing product development thinking and design thinking is a really good way of designing a new community. So design thinking tells us to think about the user, always the user. What are they going to do? How will they use this product? What problem am I solving for them? And journalism never thought like that. But I think design thinking is at the core of building trustworthy communities and building trust as a journalist with these communities to the point where you can ask them for help and for money. So that's really the way I describe it. My light bulb moment was when I was a journalist. I was a TV anchorman, and it was the biggest financial crisis in Ireland. It was really badly hit. And I started going onto Twitter and saying, hey, anybody have a question I should ask tonight of the bank or the government? And in my direct messages, I would get these like real estate agents saying, they're not telling you the truth. I know for a fact the price are dropping like this. Ask them this. And I would go on and go, you know, I was talking to somebody today and they asked me to ask this question. And it was amazing. Suddenly, I was actually listening to the audience through Twitter. And that for me was my, light bulb moment. So if I was starting from scratch, if you were starting something, I would find a few people, ask them what you should cover, how you should cover it, what they want to hear from you, tell them a little bit about your expertise, write a few stories, have a conversation, see what they think, what they don't like, what they do like. And then as the community gets bigger, start using certain tools to maybe scale that understanding from, analytics tools to Hearken, and as you get bigger, then obviously there are other things you can use, like, for example, that's why Patreon is a great place to start, or Substack, is they do give you some basic analytics to see what people like. But as you get bigger, if you decide someone in this group here wants to be the technology developer, there's a real opening right now, I think, for analytics products that help an individual journalist build a community, as you've just described. There's not really any good tools right now that allow you to see things like what time a person came into your community, what device they were on, how much time they spent with you. There's very little of that available right now. And I think that's probably where we're going to see the next wave of technological evolution in journalism.
Yeah. Who goes next?
Sir, if we have a product or a service, at what point do you think it's best to start thinking about the revenue?
So it's a great question. I mean, my simple answer is from the beginning. I would think about it like this. So one of the things I learned was how to think about fundraising and going to investors. And I'm not saying that you should all think about this from day one, but what it did help me was think about my business plan. So if I was thinking about that question about revenue, so it depends on the kind of service you're developing, but here's a way of thinking about it. There's about like a deck of slides, and it's got about 10 slides on it. And it starts with really like one line is, elevator pitch of what the product or service is and who it's going to solve a problem. So that's your front page. Then it's like, what's the problem I'm solving? So let's say in the case of Kinsen, right? We're empowering moderators to protect communities and promote healthy conversations. So that's that's the solution we've come up with. But the problem we're solving is, the information crisis. It's just like, so problem definition is very important. Your solution, and then your product, and then how do I make money out of this? So for example, if it's going to be a consumer facing product, then it's going to have to be probably a limited number of things, from subscription, membership, donations, could be advertising. And I think we will see a return to a new quality advertising system at some point. I wouldn't bank on it right now, but that's one way of thinking your better revenue model. Or you're building a product that's going to help other journalists, in which case you're thinking about a SaaS, software service model. In that case, that slide's got to tell the funder that you thought about the margins and what the monthly subscription might be and how much human service might have to be involved in that. So that's that slide. Then is the market size, the opportunity. Is this a $1 billion opportunity? And if it's not, why not? Like, over 5 years, could I see myself getting to huge valuation or a big valuable company? And then I'd obviously look at competition. Who is out there right now that's doing something like this? And why aren't they solving the problem? And it's really important to start thinking about this. Some great ways of thinking about this challenge called Jobs to Be Done. It's a framework developed by Clay Christensen, who is the person who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma. And what he's trying to say is, think about your customer. What is the job that they do every day that you can help them with? What do they really want to achieve? Who is out there at the moment is giving that solution? Why is the solution not working? And what value do you bring? So, what I'm thinking here is you can hear me thinking about writing this pitch. I'm now building my business without having a single product built or a single service created. And I think that's a great discipline for everybody to think through is, what's the problem I'm solving? What's my solution? Who out there is doing this? Why am I better? What's the value I bring? Is it a B2B, i.e. I'm selling it to someone else, another company, or is it B2C, I'm selling it to a subscriber or an individual? And then where do I want to go over 3 years? Because it doesn't have to be $1 billion company, right? It could be a nonprofit. But the point is, think these things through. And then at the end, when you've done this, you look at that deck and you're going to be embarrassed by it, because it's all like, but you know what you've done? You've almost gone through a mental training process where suddenly you're starting to think in real terms about, like, who is this consumer? How do I understand them? Do I have market research, or do I actually have friends and family I can try and experiment on? And then you get into the really exciting MVP process, and that's where design thinking comes through. So as you can tell, like, I've spent 10 years now writing and rewriting my deck over and over again in my head. I'm doing it today, by the way, for a pitch next week to another investor. And it's just, for me as a journalist, it's like the old days when I was given a deadline and I had to write a report and I had to ring people, I had to understand things, synthesize, write. And I think your question is a great question, but I think it should be part of a series of like very disciplined questions you ask yourself. What am I trying to solve? Why is my thing better? What's the customer need? And what this helps you do is avoid what I always call whiteboard paralysis, right? Most journalists have come up with a solution before they ever think about what problem they're going to solve and for who. So you get like journalists going, I'm going to do a better way for a journalist to get payment systems. And you're like, well, yeah, that's called Stripe. And then there's this one. Yeah, but this is better because it's designed by journalists. You're like, that's not the way it works. So I think a long way of answering your question, which is be thinking about revenue from day one, but as part of a very clear methodical process. So if you decide that your customer is not, as we did in Kinsen, we started out with a consumer facing product. As soon as we realized we were actually building technology for other people, we shifted over to a SaaS model, and that is a whole range of other dynamics. So now, we're enterprise software, which means we're pitching for like 4 or 5 figure a month contracts. So we only need maybe about 6 or 7 of those to make yourselves a successful business. Whereas with SaaS, you probably need a lot of people paying about, 500 to $1,000 a month. So sorry, that's a very complicated way of saying begin from the very beginning thinking about revenue, but only as part of a coherent thought process around what we always call route to market. This is the biggest mistake entrepreneurial journalists make, is saying, how do I get to a real business? What has to happen? And that's what I think where I see most entrepreneurial journalists failing is they're not thinking through the process. So to finish off, I would say, I remember going to my first investor and they asked me to give them a 4-year financial projection. And I looked at them and I went back and I came back with this like hockey stick. So we're going to have a bit of revenue here. And then suddenly in the 3rd year, the revenue is going to go off the charts. Of course, that's what everyone in business says. And I looked at it and I was like, this is fiction. I don't know what's going to happen in like 2 months, let alone 3 years. So I said to the guy after he turned me down, I said, it's bullshit, right? And I know that's bullshit. And that I know that it's bullshit. So why do we do this? He says, I'm not asking you for the right answer. I just need to see how you went through the process of getting to an answer. I have to know that you've asked yourself all the questions, not come up with all the answers. And I walked away and thought, that's what it's about. It's like, if you wanted to go and do a marathon, you wouldn't run 26 miles tomorrow. You'd start small and think about how you get the fitness. So that's just one of the things that I learned. And by the way, I've been turned down by probably more than 100 investors in my career as an entrepreneur. So, one of the things you have to do is probably be open to an awful lot of people saying no to you. But as long as you're listening and curious, you feel you get better every time. And finally, you might you just have a bad slide or a bad day, and they're not laughing at you; they're just saying to you, go back to the drawing board. So, in all honesty, the biggest thing you can learn, I think, is a mindset of the entrepreneur, not trying to imitate what great products you might have seen that impressed you, but thinking about what the entrepreneur had to go through to get to success. I think it's a great way to start. But again, sorry, that's a very long-winded way of answering the question. It's not so much the revenue, it's the customer. I think that's my short answer.
Anybody else has any more questions?
Yeah. So you talked about product development as a very important aspect that we should be looking into, right? So that's what I wanted to know, that the thing is that when I was if I think of my role as a journalist, I would think about tech as something that I would use for better presentation and to make it more immersive, etc. When I think about product development, I imagine that there are technical skills required that I'll have to develop apart from just journalistic reporting and all of that. So what are the skills you would recommend that I should get myself started with to get into product development?
It's a great question. I think the first thing is design thinking. Before you think about having to code, I wouldn't be going off now and learning to code necessarily. I mean, there are certain things you need to be. You need to be a data journalist. You need to be really comfortable. Very first thing was with an Excel spreadsheet. I know it sounds really basic, but understanding how formulas and algorithms work. Great place to start is to really just understand the way financial models work. So I would say that's a combination of 2 skills that you acquire. Number one is understanding the way in which numbers are working for your business model, but also you're understanding that you also have to be data driven, and you're also understanding some very basic, what will become important to you later on if you go down the route of writing code. So it's a good place to start, and that's something very basic. I know more important is less about finding ways to build code or to be a product development manager, which is much more about project management. So I think one of the mistakes people think is that product development is about understanding the core technologies. It's not really. It's understanding how you motivate product teams. Now, you have to have some background in working within the product environment, but it's a different skill set. And so for journalists, unless you already have a keen interest in the underlying technology. So for example, if you want to build a better question and answer forum, or you want to build some new way of, for example, building an algorithm that might do a particular task, yes, you do need some coding skills. But if what you're trying to do is lead a team primarily of technologists as a journalist, then it's much more important to start with design thinking, is understanding when you sit down to plan out a sprint cycle, let's say, that you understand how sprint and agile development works. And that's much more about project management than it is about underlying technology. It's a big mistake that I see a lot of people make, where they try, to be the expert in machine learning. They don't have to be. Machine learning is changing right now at such a speed. We have these new transformers like GPT-3 and BERT, open source models that are allowing us to exponentially scale the amount of data that we can process. I mean, literally every day there's a new development. So if I was a journalist, I would not try and delve into the current state of machine learning. I would see where it's going, and I would understand the management skills that I need to, for example, sit down and talk to a bunch of machine learning engineers who like to be people who put their headphones on and not talk to anyone and just do their job. Talk to a bunch of journalists who are always like looking for the new thing and are always distracted. So I think for journalists that are learning about technology and product, it's far more important that they understand the basic skill sets of a product manager. Starts with design thinking, agile methodology. There is still no better way to build a product from the beginning than the sprints process. Scrum masters are people to learn from in product teams. These are people who convene cross-functional teams. So the salespeople may sit in a meeting with the ML engineer, with the journalist. So understanding how to manage these cross-disciplinary teams is super important. It also opens up for you individually a much more exciting potential career as a product manager or product owner, which is a slightly different skill set as well. That's mainly about, I want to bring a product to market. And that's also hugely exciting. So the product manager puts the teams together that build the product, and the product owner takes that product and works with the business development people, a strategy to launch it. Now, all along that process, if you had talked to me about this 10 years ago, my eyes would have glazed over with boredom, because I've been involved in it, and I'm not good at it, by the way. I just happen to know now a lot about it in practice. It's such an exciting thing to learn, how to lead people who don't share the same cultures, the values, how to manage a process every week, to know what your KPIs are. This is another thing to learn a language around. Obviously, you probably all heard of KPIs. Well, there's another one called OKR, which is big in Silicon Valley. It's your objective, your known results. So setting structure is so much more important for journalists to understand than learning code. Yes, read up on the latest developments in machine learning, but understand how great product teams are built, how they design and build products. So you're not planning 2 years ahead. You're always going next sprint, next sprint. I think an interesting way to think about this is there's a company called Intercom. It's an Irish company. We used to work with them years ago. They've now a $1 billion company. And one of their product teams always said to me, they think about 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years. Where do I have to be in 6 weeks' time? Where do I want to be in 6 months? And what's my 6-year vision? And I think for any journalist who needs to learn about products, it's a really good way of thinking about it. And that's some of the things that I've learned. So yeah, I would jump in. I'm trying to give you resources that you can use. Probably, again, the membership puzzle has got some good background on this. Stanford's journalism program have got some superb resources now as well for more product-oriented entrepreneurial journalism. I'd probably think of something after I jumped off this call, but again, design thinking for journalists. If you put that in to any search engine, I think you'll come up with some great examples of it. And yeah, when you see these people, they command massive salaries. So if you try and you don't succeed as an entrepreneur, remember, being an entrepreneur is not necessarily about the outcome. It's about the skills you learn. And failure is the greatest teacher. I have never learned anything from my successes as a journalist and as an entrepreneur. The only thing I've ever learned from is failure. And sort of, I would advise everybody to think about failing upwards. Keep trying, challenging yourself, learn lessons, even when you fail. And when you're starting to see, I see it myself in big news organizations, is the people who have been entrepreneurs that failed, or they succeeded and they wanted to, stop being an entrepreneur. There's so many openings, so many opportunities for people who think in product terms in the future. So yeah, that's why I'm very excited to see people like yourself maybe thinking about this less as a technology challenge and more as a leadership challenge. Because great leaders, my definition of a great leader is where you walk into a room and people feel powerful because you're in the room. You've told them what they need to do. And they're like, oh, I get it. I have power. Whereas, managers kind of walk into a room and say, I know what I'm doing. And everybody waits for them to make a decision. A great leader is someone who walks into a room and makes everybody in that room feel powerful. So that's probably the greatest skill you can have as an entrepreneurial journalist. And like I say, that comes a lot from design thinking and thinking through the problems that you're solving.
Sir, I had one question. Since you talked about agile development of news, and journalism works a lot with time constraints. So we don't have sprints to think about. We don't have feedback times. We don't have Scrum Masters explaining us how it happens. So how do we, converge agile development into journalism?
It's a great question. And it's back to the question we talked about earlier on about how do I build trust? So you're absolutely right. Like if you think about journalism, an entrepreneurial journalist is a contradiction in terms, right? Journalists can't get it wrong. Like you say, right? We got to get that deadline. And if we're wrong, it's a disaster, right? We don't like asking people questions. We want to ask the questions. We don't like other people telling us we're wrong because we're always right. So if you think about a culture that is, less liable to be entrepreneurial, it's our culture. So how do we change it? Well, I think the way we do it is by thinking about small experiments. So clearly you don't want to do anything that has such a high risk that it could collapse your business or destroy the trust you have with your community. So, if you wake up one morning and say, hey guys, I'm thinking about doing something today, and by the end of the day, you go back and say, it was a mistake, it was wrong. Like a small daily experiment where there's a kind of I'm going to try this, it could work, it might not work. It's about finding small enough experiments that give you data to tell you where you're right or where you're wrong, but they can't be so big that the entire future of your trust on your business is basically risked on that. So that's, I think, where agile development suddenly becomes an opening for you, not a prison, because it's every 2 weeks. So it's very quickly apparent whether you have the data to prove a success, or very quickly it's a failure and you can just turn around and go, okay, let's try again. We've learned what went wrong. We think we got a better way of chancing it for the next 2 weeks. So by agile, remember, that's about the idea of like quick lessons learned, failures, data led, not data driven, measuring your performance, listening more. So, I think that is how we make the transition from one very different culture to this entrepreneurial culture, is by learning to fail in short bursts in such a way that it doesn't threaten the trust we built. In fact, it adds to it by admitting our failure, but we do it in such a way that it's never going to endanger the survival of the business we're building or the community that we've gathered around us. So yeah, it's a difficult to navigate, but when you start to tell people to expect you're going to be wrong sometimes, they get to trust you. Like, yeah, this is not a pompous know-it-all. They're actually with me, and that's back to the point about trust. So, for everyone, I hire some journalists and they can't stand being wrong. I'm like, you know what? Go away and come back in 6 months when you've been wrong a couple of times. Then we'll talk. So yeah, I have a very different expectation now than I did maybe 10 years ago.
So one more question. So about politics, like a lot of people, like a lot of us would want to go for entrepreneurial journalism, not because knowing that it might not pay well in the beginning years, because the traditional media organizations are like basically sellouts to the political party in power. So the thing is that even social media, sometimes it comes up that it is not as democratic a space as it appears, like definitely in comparison to traditional media. For example, with the Facebook and BJP thing, we know that the political party in power has weaponized social media as well to curb pages that criticize it. So if we are trying to build a community which is like subaltern and which does not have as much say, even on social media, how do we tackle that? For example, even on Instagram, there's a problem of shadow banning going on, which might have been very well intentioned, but the way it has been, like I have seen it playing out, is that it targets pages or hashtags which are actually I don't know, they're more people oriented than I don't know, like there are a lot of movements that are social movements that might be building up and then they get killed because of shadow banning. So how do we tackle that in a way that it doesn't like affect like somebody who's already fledgling?
It's a great question. I mean, I have to say to you, first of all, don't trust the platforms. Like, I don't mean that. There's a lot of great people working inside the platforms, but here's the basic problem, particularly if you're in somewhere like India or even Ireland to a lesser extent. So the average revenue for a social media user in the United States is like exponentially greater than the average revenue Facebook makes out of someone who is in India using Facebook. So here's the problem. They don't really care, right? And I let's be honest about this. You know, I remember going to someone and saying, hey, this is someone on Twitter. I said, 79% of Twitter's users are outside the United States. And they're like, yeah, but 79% of the revenue is from inside the United States. So that'll tell you where they care, right? So particularly for you guys, don't set up your business on the platforms, right? These platforms are very good places to engage and market, and they are places you can distribute, and they are places that you can sell, but don't set the business up on those platforms. I would argue that, you know, start off on a tool or a platform that is not controlled by the major, as we call them, FANGs, right? The Facebooks or the Amazons, etc. Don't get too dependent on any technology platform that is selling the attention of your community. That's the number one rule. So it's almost like a health check. Let's say you set up a newsletter and it's on WordPress. Pretty good chance that's open source technology. WordPress is a pretty good organization. It's a .org, so it's actually got a mission in the world. So you've got a platform that you know is never going to turn around and do a secret deal with the government, right? It's pretty much open. So I'm just saying as an example, not that you should go to work for WordPress. I think Substack is a platform that's run by journalists, and I think they care. I think they're making some mistakes, but they're learning. I think that if you set up a Twitch account to talk to your platform, I think that's a pretty good, you know, platform to market yourself on, but I would not base your business on any platform that doesn't care about you. That's really key to this. You know, these platforms don't really care in the end of the day because they got to make money. I do think some platforms are different. Twitter, and I know I did work for them, so I would say this, they have a different set of values. Like, I sat with Jack Dorsey, I've listened to him, I've heard him. I know they've made mistakes, but I believe that he genuinely wants to be a force for democracy, and they're taking decisions and doing things that are difficult for them and their business models. So some platforms have better values than others. But the most important thing is, when I'm starting out to organize my community, don't do it around your Twitter account, your Facebook page, your Instagram page. They are great places to engage people, but the core of your stability as a business has to be away from them. So that's why I think it's more important to be looking at Spotify as a platform where you might build, you know, your podcast, but don't make it the only source of revenue you have, because they could turn it off in a moment when the algorithm changes. So that would be my sense. It's like, try find spaces where you have control over the underlying power, you know, and that's why places like WordPress have always been a great place to look. And then I would regard then these big platforms as being places where you market, you engage, you go out, but you don't use those platforms to generate the trust you need to generate the revenues that you probably need to support you. That's probably my broader, my organizational sort of advice is don't start on those platforms, because they will ultimately find a way to change the rules without telling you. But I think there's an important opportunity, particularly I think in a place like India, or in the, like for example, Indonesia is one of, so when I was in Twitter, we were stunned by the level of passion around European football in Bahasa. So believe me, in Silicon Valley, they're not thinking about Bahasa, but we could see that Manchester United had more supporters in Indonesia than it had in the UK. And suddenly we were like, wow, the world is composed of a lot more people than you think about if you're thinking about Silicon Valley. So you in particular, I would argue, have a power to recognize where communities are forming that are authentic, that are real, that are of the place you live or of the passions of the people that you serve. And I think there's an opportunity to start thinking about the next wave of social media, which I think will be a fragmentation of the big, powerful Silicon Valley platforms. And we're going to start seeing the emergence of like micro networks that are based on, Bahasa speaking Manchester United supporters. There's a community right now that if I was an entrepreneurial journalist, I would want to own that. I wouldn't build it on Twitter. I'd go and find some other platform that I know I've got control over. And I would just go out there and I would just be talking about Man United in Bahasa. Or in Vietnam, I discovered there were 95 Twitter accounts talking about Manchester United in Vietnam. So these are examples where you potentially could exploit the underlying weaknesses of these platforms in a much more powerful way than someone living in San Francisco or London or Amsterdam or Stockholm, because you now know there's a part of the world that these Silicon Valley companies are just not serving properly. And I think if you start from that position, you suddenly can turn the question on its head and say, not only will we not be dependent on some tech bro wearing a Patagonia sweater vest in San Francisco, we're actually going to turn this around and build the first micro engagement network for people from our own community. And in that circumstance, I think your question could actually be the basis for a new business, and not just how do we avoid becoming part of the bot armies that are supporting the government on Facebook. Well, you know what? I think consumers are waking up to the fact that there's all this inauthentic, hateful behavior that is being promoted by political supporters, that is being allowed by Facebook. And there's a moment when the consumers are so pissed off that they're going to look for someone to say, no, I want safety. I want moderation. I want respect. I want people to tell me from the get-go, we cannot say certain things. And I think you guys are probably perfectly positioned to think about what those communities look like, the authenticity of the rules, exactly what kind of communities are possible when you don't have to answer to a head of growth in San Francisco or wherever. So that's my manifesto. If you seek to take it, I really would love to feel like in 2 years' time, I'm going to meet someone on this call who said, I set up my own little social network, and now, we have much cleaner, healthier, quality conversations, and we're not dominated by the government. Yeah, that would be my ambition for I think some of you, not all of you.
Thank you, sir. That was very helpful.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's been inspiring.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. As I say, I really genuinely feel like if I could say one thing, it's don't look to the Silicon Valley people, I think, for inspiration. Like, look into your own communities and find out what they will need over the next 5 to 10 years. And that's where your businesses will lie. And also, by the way, that's where your money and your fundraising will happen, because there's a lot of very smart people in the world now realizing that, that you are the future. So yeah, my very best wishes to all of you. And I'm on Twitter mainly, the main social network, @Mark Little News. I'm very happy to engage.
Sure.
Hopefully I can be helpful.
Yeah.
Build great businesses.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Can I show you a contact with them? And some of you might want to get in touch with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Mark.
So, thank you.
Best of luck to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.